Welcome back to the Fire Break. I'm Steve Wolf. As you know, the Fire Break is sponsored by Team Wildfire, where we're developing some really cool new ways to fight wildfires. And not just the fire in general, but of course, stop them from hurting the things we care about, like people and property and the environment. So, in that pursuit, I've got Anthony Power with us today. And Anthony is coming to us from the future. In fact, 17 hours in the future from my reality, down under in Queensland, Australia. Anthony, welcome to the Fire Break. How are you today?
Yeah, good. Thank you, Steve. Thanks.
Good.
Yeah, good to be here.
So when we talk, okay, and excuse my calling it, wildfire. I know it's bushfire in the future and in Australia. We can't really think about bushfire and not think about Australia because it's your leading domestic product, and you've eclipsed every other country in volume and in expenditure and in labor force, in dealing with this challenge. What's going on down there these days, and what are you doing about it?
Yeah, is Mr. Anthony Power, I guess, called Lichia Glorhana Ahanam, which is Scottish Gaelic for, well, I'm Anthony Power and I'm a bushfire consultant. So shout out to my Gaelic teacher, Adam, who's in Alberta, of all places. But,
Wait,
Australia's a very big country, so the fire season sort of goes up and down the coastline, and where I am in Queensland, not too bad at the moment, but further down south, they're copping it pretty bad at the moment.
and so you had a lot of experience with fire before you came to work in architecture and landscape design for fire mitigation. What was your background and why?
Well, I suppose it was an interesting story. I studied town planning at uni and then got a job with the local council. And in that role, we would assess new development against regulation. And one of the regulations was to do with bushfire. And as a noob town planner, I'd look at this bushfire code and go, well, I don't know anything about bushfire. Why do you want me to, assess these things against bushfire? This is crazy. Like, I know nothing. And so at the same sort of time, I bought a acreage property in a rural area with my parents. And one of the first things you do when you do that is you start tidying the property up, and you end up cutting out weed trees and making stacks of them. And so how do I get rid of these stacks of, weeds and stuff? And the standard practice is pretty much to burn them. So you have to get a permit to light fire from your local fire warden. So I took myself off to the local fire warden, and his name was Bernie. So I said, hey, Bernie. And I said, can I have a permit? And he said, yeah, but you look like a likely lad. Come and join the fire brigade. And so, no, okay, well, this will be kind of useful for the town planning stuff I'm doing, because I don't know anything about fire at the moment, and I'm being asked to do this fire stuff. I'll go do that. So I became a volunteer in the rural fire service, and would go do prescribed burning and stacks and stuff like I was doing at home for people, and attend wildfires and all that kind of stuff. So sort of rose through the ranks there, and I got pretty heavily involved. And during that time, a new degree started at the University of Western Sydney, which sort of combined the two things. So town planning and bushfire. So I went and did that, and so I've been doing it ever since then, really, which was back in 2000 or something like that. So a little.
Wow. I can imagine that towns would look very, very different than the way we see them if they were designed by people who were also firefighters.
Well, they would.
So when you design a town and you go in with such a heavy eye on fire protection, risk reduction, what looks different? What are the things that you do to make those towns safer that other people aren't doing and probably should do?
Well, it's fairly heavily regulated in Australia. So there's standard things like fire breaks, and then there's what you probably call hardening of structures and that kind of thing. And there's Australian standards for the construction of buildings to make them resistant to bushfire attack, which means flame attack, radiant heat flux, and ember attack, and but partially wind. You could even add smoke. Um, and then there's standard sort of practices like putting in perimeter roads, fire trails, escape routes, all this kind of stuff, and that looks fairly similar across the regulatory landscape of Australia. Um, and there's a heap of modelling that sort of goes in behind that, and I also trained as a landscape architect, and one of the things that probably isn't very well regulated or understood is the arrangement of fuels within inside the suburbs, which could probably be done a little better for the most part. But in our role where we are looking to apply new technologies to understand and characterize fire behavior better than these regulations currently do, because they're probably a little simplistic. So really adopting a data-driven approach to characterize fire and simulate them and do that thousands of times, so we get a better understanding of the bushfire attack in the WUI, which is the wildland urban interface, and then using that knowledge to then redesign so it's a safer outcome for firefighters and the community. And you can test those designs in the technologies we're using. So actually, it doesn't make a difference. Is it better? That kind of thing. So it's pretty cool.
So you're basically building like Fire Sim City, right? You can build a
Yeah, well, you
city,
can to
you can
some
start a
extent.
fire
Yeah,
next to it, and then you could see how much
yeah,
burns down, and then you could rearrange the houses or add more fire breaks or change from OSB to different materials, and then you light it again, and the computer can do this thousands of times until it's
yep,
it's shaped out a housing plan that
yeah. Well, that's
has the
right. So
minimum
you
right.
got to do it in virtual land and in real life. So yeah, so to get
Yeah,
those insights but it's not just designing towns though. We have specifically done that, particularly what we call greenfield sites, which is a clean slate. So if the urban designers are getting in there on behalf of the developers or the city or whoever's instigating the design, and designing against codes, etc. And it's a complicated business because there's a whole heap of factors to consider, as well as just bushfire. So there's urban design issues, housing density, traffic flow, civil engineering, all sorts of stuff, landscape architecture, ecology, lots of things that go into it. And then our part is one part with the bushfire stuff. So it's good having an understanding of all those other working parts and coming up with solutions that meet multiple objectives. But, it's interesting
And what?
job.
Yeah, that's fascinating. What's the software program that you work on called?
Well, we use Spark, which is developed by the CSIRO. There are others. So there's Phoenix Rapid Fire. They're the main two, and we're working on our own as well, which we hope to use in time.
What a career, right? Having gone from one thing to the next, and keep
Yeah, it's
finding
always
yourselves
evolving.
right, like in
Yeah,
in in unexpected new challenges that you definitely enjoy.
yeah, and that's
S-
quite interesting. And just sort of you go further down the rabbit hole. So started studying at university as well, my local uni, doing research on fire weather and how we can use some of these tools for these kind of applications, and getting policy to recognise that these tools and techniques have value. Um,
w-
the way I came across it was because I used to sit next to a flood modeler, and he had all these fancy programs, and you'd see the flood waters move across his computer screen, and then he would design appropriately to match what was being modelled. And I sat next to him with an Excel spreadsheet, trying to characterize fire, it's like, well, this isn't quite right. Like we really are behind the eight ball here. Compared to the maturity of a flood engineering modeler, and they have entire engineering processes that back it up, that they go through is really quite mature. Whereas in the bushfire space, we're probably a few decades behind, and really keen to try and bridge that gap as much as we can, because it's important, and we can. There's these systems that are out there in engineering space, and the technology is catching up in the wildfire space with simulation technology, etc. And there's no reason why these two things can't meet, and we can have a much better and more mature way of applying these technologies that have so far traditionally been used by predictive service agencies in fire authorities to predict the forward spread of fires. But I think we're kind of all realizing that these sort of things can be used for risk analysis and mitigation. And then it's coming up with meaningful data to put into these sort of technologies, so you can advise appropriately at that local scale. So the first thing I always sort of think of is someone says, okay, can you design me a mitigation program for X? And say, okay, well, how big a fire do we need to look at? So that's where the fire behaviour characterization and locally meaningful data is really important to answer that question. So when you know how big a fire you actually should be dealing with, then you can start making appropriate recommendations, etc. And that needs technology and engineering processes to effectively resolve.
Well, you talked about the regulation and how research becomes rules. And I would imagine that you're kind of at the leading edge, or the burning edge of the research. And then as you develop new theories or new data or new best practice recommendations, what's the time lag between when you realize that a new best practice should be implemented and when it becomes a regulation?
Good question. We've been doing it for 5 years or so, where I just gave everything up of my previous career just to pursue simulation modelling, and to do that professionally, I suppose. So before that, it was a spreadsheet and it was standard kind of stuff, and I was doing other things like landscape architecture, town planning. Really pursued it for about 5 years, and that was when I had a discussion with the CSIRO, which is kind of like Australia's kind of leading scientific organisation, and they were developing Spark, and just rang them up and said, hey, you got this Spark simulation program, are you going to make it available commercially? And they said, yeah. And so I said, fantastic, this is what I've been waiting for. And so then we went backwards and forwards and turned it into something slightly different that was more suited to what we needed it to do. And then we jumped on board. So, been into it ever since, really. To answer your question, has this been recognised in policy yet? Not that I'm aware of, though policymakers and others in the wildfire landscape in Australia are starting to become aware that these sort of technologies do exist. But at this stage, it's not really wholly taken up across the industry that I'm in. There's a few firms that I know are sort of doing it, but it's very small at the moment. But I honestly do believe that in 10 years' time, there will be fire modelling firms, which there could well be in America already, just as there are flood modelling firms all across Australia, for instance. So.
Right. Very interesting. I hadn't heard that floods were such an issue in Australia.
Yeah, probably almost more so where I live. The floods all the time.
That's
Well,
interesting.
not all the time. Yeah, when it's wet.
In the fire modeling programs that you work with, does the model proceed with the fire as if the fire were unimpeded by suppression activities, or can you also model out the impact of different suppression efforts as the fire matures?
You can't do it very well. So Short answer, probably no, but then you can retard the fire if you know the way it's potentially being attacked. So you can add in things called masks, which stop certain areas burning, that kind of thing. Uh, so it's kind of difficult to do. With the other program, Phoenix Wildfire, there is a suppression algorithm, built in, but it's based on certain assumptions, and you could probably say it's fairly crude. But in terms of what we're doing, we're not so much interested in the suppression efforts, but the potential and what that means, as if it weren't defended, potentially. So um, characterizing, that, and then building for that worst case is kind of what we try to do, as opposed to trying to assume a level of suppression which may or may not occur and may not be
Right.
possible either. So.
Right. So you try to design a space so that it'll have the highest chance of surviving a bushfire with no mitigation effort in place.
Yeah,
And
correct.
that's great. That probably reduces uh, the demand on the suppression resources.
Yeah, and in very bad seasons, they get so stretched as well. So, they can't have fire trucks everywhere, and that kind of thing. So,
Based on your closeness to the bushfire space, have you noticed a change in the last 5, 10, 15 years? According to
yeah,
the news, it all looks like it's
yeah,
getting worse. So is that your experience down there?
yeah. Well, my experience as a bushfire consultant in Queensland, Southeast Queensland, where I am, is a subtropical environment. So, um, it's in terms of wildfire, it's not so bad as other parts of Australia, and the attitude kind of probably other bushfire consultants around that might listen to this may relate, but I used to get asked, come on, Anthony, when was the last time a house burnt down in Queensland? And then since Black Summer, that has changed quite a lot, and so the attitude has definitely changed, and we lost something like 40 something houses in that one season, and some of the records that I'd seen prior to that was a similar amount across the history of the state, being lost. Though I think those records are a little fuzzy. So to go to double what we've lost ever in Queensland in one season, changed the view towards it. And then of course the terrible fires that happened across New South Wales and Victoria and the scale of them. I think public perception has changed, and that has led to a change in how we're sort of perceived as giving meaningful advice and advice that's important as well. So yes, definitely, to answer your question, big
Yeah,
change.
things are getting worse. In a word,
Yeah, I think so, and also because we've in Queensland as well, because historically urban settlement patterns have not taken the issue particularly seriously. The landscape is what we call very occluded and mixed, so there's a lot of urban development intermingled with um, hazardous vegetation and bushfire prone areas. So the area and extent to defend is harder and larger, and population is growing, and so it's quite a potentially dangerous mix. So you have these sort of landscape patterns and scales and dynamics which are all occurring and making the problem potentially worse than it was historically as well. So you can expect probably a little bit more trouble going forward.
so what changes do you think we have to make as quickly as possible to prepare for the magnitude of fire that's on its way?
Uh, so many things, but I'd,
Good
I'd,
answer.
I'd, I'd like to see society be more accepting of good fire in the landscape, and having that much more widespread. Uh, historically, with Indigenous practitioners, they would have implemented that, and the landscape would have looked a lot different to it does today. So uh, yeah, we probably need to change, probably a Eurocentric, perception of fire being, bad, and realize that it can be actually a nourishing process, and that the country, needs it to a certain extent, and right fire in the right place. So it's not a bad thing to see puffs of white smoke around the place, and that's okay, and it's good, and it means that we are treating it properly, and the fuels are being reduced, and that kind of thing. So that perception across society is important. But then there's a whole heap of other things to do with suppression and landscape planning, and more resources put towards it. So we putting my landscape designer's hat on, we think about potential for fire, and how we can design landscapes, be they conservation reserves, new settlements, roads, etc., to aid in that effort. So we want fire management to be simple. You don't want it to be too complex. So it means being able to facilitate that with infrastructure and people, more fire practitioners that know how to put right fire on the ground, etc., and are knowledgeable about fire behaviour and fire patterns and fuel dynamics, and being able to read the countryside and knowing when to do this kind of stuff I see as being very important. And then some of that knowledge permeating across society in general, and then accepting that we all need to do a bit. So it might mean arranging some of the fuel or landscape around your home in an appropriate way. I like to tell people in my other landscape architecture hat, when they're designing landscapes around people's homes or a new suburb, they're arranging fuel. So you can do it well or you can do it poorly. So let's do it well. And you can still achieve a great design outcome with amenity and all the other objectives that you want to achieve. But just that little bit of fire behaviour knowledge will, make a big difference in terms of, potentially making a big problem or having a great outcome. So there's just so many different things I'd like to see. But also the fire modelling and the insights that can bring, and having that adopted by my industry rather than using an Excel spreadsheet. That kind of
That's
stuff
right.
we can do a bit better.
Yeah. I think that was fascinating the way you phrased that, that when someone thinks they're going out to do gardening or some landscape, vegetation, whatever, that, you would just characterize it asking, how are you arranging the fuels around your house?
Yeah, well, the wildfire will,
Right.
doesn't
And most
see it
people
as, oh,
don't
that's a
think that
pretty
they're
green
planting
thing
their
that's around
fuel,
that.
right?
It's just, yep, it's going to land embers on there, and if it's flammable, it's going to burn, and then what's that next to? And you get this domino cascading potential effect. So if we can break that domino effect by arranging it properly or cleverly, just with a little bit of knowledge and maintaining that too, then you can start breaking up these potential chain reactions. So identifying where those little domino effects are, and then breaking that cycle through appropriate landscape design and arrangement is important. So the
Is there
first
a
6 feet
resource
quite
for that?
critical.
Because all of the resources
Yeah,
I've seen on this tell you what not to do, right? Clear the first, meter and a half around your house is nothing. And then, 10 meters out, nothing that's going to generate, high radiation to light your house up, and, zone XYZ, right? All
yeah.
the things not to do. So how does that tell a homeowner, what they should do, what they should plant, what plants are more fire resistant? Where can you put them? How do you not build a ladder that ends with your house on fire?
Yeah, it's tricky, but I suppose you need to come back to a bit of first principles. So if there's a knowledge of fire behaviour there, and how it attacks a structure, so you can start thinking about that, and then how your landscape design, because landscape design, it's personal as well, and is has to meet multiple objectives. It's not just about fire. So maybe people have kids or something like that, and they want an area for them to play, or you want a veggie patch, or fruit trees, all these different things. So how do you arrange all that and meet those requirements, as well as being fire wise? And space is limited too, so you might only have a certain number of square meters or feet to landscape, etc. So to meet all these things can be tricky. But going back to first principles, so if a fire front is emerging from adjoining vegetation, you're going to have flames, and flames can reach out if they're big enough and the gap's small enough to directly touch. So you want to avoid that. So that would be one of the first things. And then there's heat which is coming out of that, and that can be really, really hot, and you can't stand there and actually defend if it's close enough. That so there's those considerations. And then also you have the embers, which are probably the most important. So they're small parts of the vegetation which is burning in the fire front and being deposited, sometimes en masse, like many embers per square metre, and they get entrained and caught on parts of the structure and the landscape, and they build up. And then that turns into small fires, and if they're building against flammable parts of a structure or a landscape, they will start to burn, and you get that cascading effect. So okay, well, with that knowledge, you can say, okay, well, what can we do about that? So we need to be further enough away so the flames can't contact. That's a good start. And then we can start modelling the amount of heat that's potentially coming out of these fires, and, being far enough away so you can defend that without getting crispy chickened. And then you can look at, okay, well, there's embers as well, and we don't want that falling on vegetation that can then, ignite and then ignite the structure. So let's move that a little bit away. We can start attenuating heat flux by building, shields of flammable walls or even less flammable plants that can intercept some of these embers and provide shielding, behind it to reduce the amount of heat flux that's an incident on the structure. Putting water supplies in, the appropriate places. There's quite a lot of things, but all these things need to be considered with the other objectives of the landscape design as well. So it can be quite a complex process, and it needs sometimes creative thinking. And I tell landscape architects, like, you guys, you're really creative thinkers, and you can solve some of these problems, but let's just factor in the fire stuff as well. So
Right.
and you can come up with really good outcomes. So I think my other hat profession can play a big part in this. And particularly Australia, like for the landscape architecture, well, the landscape naturally is fire prone. It's part of the landscape, so let's learn about it. So I'd love to see landscape architectural programs at universities start to include a little bit of this. So let's learn about fire in the landscape, because we're landscape architects. It means a bit of fire and what we do about that too. So I think that I'd love to see that.
That's fascinating. I mean, I've been a student of fire for quite a while, and I've never heard someone speak so clearly about the role of landscaping from a positive standpoint. Here's what you do so that you can enjoy your property the way you want to and meet the needs of your family, your kids, your community, and do that in a way where you're rearranging the fuels safely as well as
Yeah,
attractively.
and
So you
and
said
it
you'd like to
doesn't.
see.
Yeah. Yeah, and it doesn't just have to be around a home either. You can do this on a landscape or large scale too. So, for instance, in South Australia, you get a lot of really wind-driven fires with long elliptical shapes across croplands and farms, and that they're characterised by really strong winds. So, okay, well, if wind's a real big problem, let's look at how we can change the landscape with properly designed infrastructure of windbreaks to reduce that. So, property planning on farms could include windbreaks of less flammable species that are well defended with breaks around themselves so they don't become part of the attack and propel the fire forward. But in the leeward side of those windbreaks, it will reduce the fire spread because the wind interacting with the flames as it moves across and through is far reduced. So, when you start looking at the fire behaviour algorithms, because they give you clues of what you can do. So they'll list the variables in them that affect fire spread. And so you can say, okay, well, what is wind speed? Okay, it's an important part of this fire behaviour spread thing. Well, what if we reduce that? How do I do that? Oh, windbreak. That kind of thing. So,
You
and then
build a
there's
mountain over here, right?
yeah, well, that's not necessarily unsensible. So I was involved in within reason, a project where we were looking at potential fire behaviour on a new suburb, and because it was a greenfield site and we could do almost anything, so we can arrange the lots, we can arrange the roads, and we were putting back fuel in certain parts because there was ecological imperatives and things like that and standards to meet. But one of the things we could also do is you can change the grades of things with earthworks where you're putting that fuel back. So if you put fuel because you need to revegetate for whatever reason on a steep slope, then obviously that's going to result in more fire behaviour or greater fire behaviour. But you can start breaking that up. Okay, well, let's drop the slope and then put less flammable fuel on that, and then we can meet the changing grade with other things like retaining walls that are not flammable. That this kind of stuff. This is where the power of good landscape design can help. Defend communities and homes and that kind of thing, and then you can model that. So that's exactly what we did. So we put this stuff in. You can create digital elevation models, drop it in your model, change the fuel on those sort of things, and then estimate the heat flux. And then how's that interacting where the houses are? Oh yeah, no, that's no good. We need to change this bit here, and then you do it. You tell your design team you need to do this. How about dropping the slope a little bit there, putting extra retaining wall to make the grade that you need, etc. And then we do it again, and then bingo, problem solved.
That is
that kind of
absolutely
thing.
fascinating. It really is Fire Sim City.
Well, exactly, yeah, and then this is the
And if I
power
put
of
in this type of
potential
trees at this
technology.
distance, this is what the fire would look like. Or if we change that to other
Yeah,
tree, that's so cool.
yeah.
Anthony, this what a fascinating conversation. Really eye opening
Well, there's a lot of
view
things that we
of what
can
you
do
do.
with good design. But yeah, the other one that I'd like to see more is looking at landscape architecture at a broader scale. So if we just break down fire into what it kind of is, it's like a energy transfer process, and so you have chemical reactions going on, but the fire gets its energy from three main things, but then also another two potentially. So you got fuel, you got the weather, and you have topography. So we've sort of spoken about those a bit, but then there's also the atmosphere. So when you have atmospheric instability, that can give energy to a fire and make it worse. You can't do much about the atmosphere, unfortunately. Um, and then the other one is environmental moisture gradient. So as the fire interacts with areas of higher moisture, then it tends to retard. So can we change the environmental moisture gradients across the landscape? Well, and sometimes we can. So, in a great example, naturally occurring in North America is the little old beavers who are, drilling little tunnels across the streams and stuff, and they're bringing water from the streams into the surrounding landscape. And there's been some really great research over there how beavers can increase that environmental moisture gradient. So you have dry landscape and then a more moist landscape where the beaver's habitat is. And as fire moves through that drier stuff and hits the moister stuff, it tends to retard. So this has been documented over there. But we can do the same things artificially. So we
Right.
can restore our riparian zones, particularly where the landscape is suited to that. So in my location or region, we have a subtropical landscape, and what grows along the waterways from riparian zones is rainforest in a lot of cases. Rainforest doesn't tend to burn very well, and it holds its moisture. So in appropriate locations, you can start to put this sort of back and restore ecosystem function, but also add a benefit of um, almost like natural fire containment blocks. Like if you have a fire engineering process in a building, you're building walls that retard fire spread through that structure. Well, you can do the same sort of thing across the landscape to some extent. Um, and under particular normal conditions, yeah, maybe under really extreme conditions where you have prolonged drought, it becomes less effective. But um, still, I believe that kind of thing can be really useful. And with the tools that we have with fire characterization and building SimCity virtual landscapes and lighting fires, then you can start to see some of these insights. And this is really important to do. And we can use it to assess all sorts of landscape strategies. So, yeah, looking and working with nature to create these sustainable solutions that is considerate of fire is really important and something that I'd like to see done better.
Absolutely. That is fascinating. A whole new realm of fire science that I knew nothing about. So thank you for that. Would you join me again on another episode? Because it sounds like you have a lot more to share on this. And
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no problem. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, delighted
that'd be
to.
great.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
love talking about
thanks
it.
so
Yeah.
much for joining me today.
No, my pleasure. Yeah. Thanks
Absolutely.
for
Well,
having me.
thank you. We've been chatting with Anthony Power. Anthony is down in Queensland, Australia, and I could introduce him so much better now that I know more about what he does. But he's really looking at how do we design spaces with fire in mind, knowing that the fire's coming. That's really, really fascinating, and I appreciate you taking the time to share that with me. This
Yeah, my
Anthony
pleasure.
Power, and Anthony, if folks want to get in touch with you, what's the best way to reach out to you?
You can contact our firm, Covey Associates, yeah, or LinkedIn. I'm fairly active on there. So.
Okay, well, I'll put a link to your LinkedIn here on our website. So thank you again, and thank you all for watching or listening to the Fire Break. I'm Steve Wolf. We're sponsored by Team Wildfire. We'll see you at the next one. Take care.
Thanks, Steve.